afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this interesting webinar. I'm so excited to have you all join us. And I'm very happy that we're hosting this during the month of February, the celebration of the Black Month history. See, my brain is out already. Anyway, so I'm so excited to be here. It's also one of the reasons I'm freezing in my mind. My name is Titilayo Okoro. I have the privilege of serving as the chair for the African Studies Department at BMT University. It's really my honor to welcome you to these very interesting conversations that we've been having. And I want to use this opportunity also to introduce my co-moderator, Mr. Richis Sebuharara, see? You should have told me how to pronounce it. The Assistant Director for the BMT University Multicultural Resource Center. Thank you so much, Mr. Richie. So the African Studies Department at BMT University is doing these in collaboration with the Multicultural Resource Center based on a number of conversations we've had. So we're very excited to have our panelists with us. I must say that our panelists are leading figures in the area of research, and I believe we have a lot to learn from them. So to start us off, so not to waste too much time, I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then I'm going to have each of the panelists present, and then we're going to open it up for conversation and for discussion. So starting us off, I have the privilege and honor to introduce to you all Dr. Sia Kibona Clark. She's an assistant professor in the Department of African Studies at Howard University. She was born in Tanzania to a Tanzanian father and African-American mother, and she was raised in the United States. Her research focuses on representation of Pan-Africanism, African feminism, and African identities in popular culture. Sia's research also explores women of African descent in cyber activism and their engagement in digital and social media spaces. She has published several articles, chapters, and books on hip-hop in Africa and the Black transnationalism. She's also a photographer and a podcaster, and she hosts a podcast called the HipHop African Blog. So we're very excited and honored to have you with us, Dr. Clark. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. So, starting off, I will say that my research, of course, was definitely influenced by my own identity and experiences, specifically being Tanzanian and African American, even kind of, the question of how do you identify and what specifically do you call yourself has always been a complicated one. It's always kind of been an asterisk. Whatever I say, there's always kind of an explanation behind it. And so it's, I'm originally from Tanzania, or I'm, was born in Tanzania, and so all of that really kind of influenced my own research. So being kind of Tanzanian and African American, being born in Tanzania and raised in Cleveland, at a time when the Tanzanian community was basically non-existent, really shaped, the quest to find out more and to really understand really what it meant to be Tanzanian, but I think more broadly what it meant to be African, especially when my father passed away when I was a freshman in college. And there was this fear that my identity as a Tanzanian would also kind of die with him.
Wow. Dr. Clark, sorry to interrupt you, because I think this is starting us off with a very interesting conversation. But I want to use this opportunity also to introduce the other panelists before we get into this, because I think you raised up many of the issues I want us to talk about in this context, this intersection of being of one thing or the other. No, not to worry.
I'm so sorry. I was going
No, but this is exciting. You're talking about what we want to talk about. So that's exciting.
I'm sorry.
No,
okay.
I love it. So
I was wondering, I'm like, I'm not supposed to go first. Why am I
No, not to worry about it. No, that's perfect. Okay. That's perfect. I'm sure our participants are very excited to hear your story, because that's what we want. We don't want we want to have a conversation about this. So thank you for starting us off the right way. I
All
love
right.
the tone you've set for this conversation. I really do. So I'm going to introduce our second panelist. I'm so excited. Exactly. See, folks are already saying they're excited to hear more. See, I told you, this is nice. So I'm so excited to introduce our next panelist, which is Dr. Kaleigh Bay Lambers. Dr. Kaleigh Bay Lambers is an assistant professor at SUNY Cortland, our mother college down the road, where he teaches and researches in health behaviors, health disparities, and health outcomes among culturally diverse populations. His research interests specifically involve immigrant health and the development of transnational ties among immigrants. This is interesting. He identifies as a 1.5 generation transnational Nigerian American. He was born in Lagos, Nigeria, and he immigrated to the United States at the age of 8, where he grew up in Chicago, Illinois. He received his undergraduate and doctorate degrees in community health from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and received his postdoctoral training at the University of Florida. Dr. Kaleigh, welcome to the panel.
Thank you so much.
Yes. So our next presenter is, of course, Dr. Delica Sal. I'm so happy I got the name right. Dr. Delica Sal is an assistant professor of sociology at Lehman College, CUNY. Her qualitative research focuses on the integration and racialization processes of second-generation West African youth in New York City. This research has been supported by grants from the National Science Foundation and has been published in journals like Ethnic and Racial Studies, the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies, and African and the Black Diaspora. So, Dr. Sal, welcome. And finally, definitely not the least, we're very happy to have you with us also, Dr. Funmilayo Showers. Dr. Funmilayo is an assistant professor of sociology and African Studies at the University of Connecticut, where she's also a faculty affiliate of the Institute of Collaboration on Health Intervention and Policy and the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. Our research centers on international migration and immigrant integration, immigrants, labor and entrepreneurship, African immigrants in the US, and the social organization of health and long-term care in the US. Her book, Migrants Who Care, West Africans at the Front Lines of the US Healthcare, chronicles the lived experiences of West African immigrants as healthcare workers and labor market brokers and entrepreneurs in healthcare provision in the United States. I must say here, she's originally, I'm going to skip and say, she's originally from Freetown, Sierra Leone. And there's a story behind it I'm sure our participants will be eager to learn about. So on that note, I'll turn it over to our panelists. Our panelists are going to go first and talk about their work and their own experiences. And then we're going to open it up for questions and comments from our participants. So I'm very excited. So Dr. Kaleigh, we'll turn it over to you. So Dr. Kaleigh is going to go first, followed, of course, by our able Dr. Clark that has started this conversation for us. And then we're going to have Dr. Sal and then Dr. Funmilayo talk a bit, and then we're going to open it up to everyone. So Dr. Kaleigh, you have our attention, please. You're muted. You need to unmute.
Sorry, I was trying to share the screen. Give me one. There you go. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Kaleigh Bay Lambers, as already introduced, so I won't be too redundant. But I do want to say that as I get into this, because this conversation is not necessarily going to be very research-like, and we're going to get more into an interaction, I'll definitely calm down on my lexicon, and I'll probably try to talk in a manner that's more relatable and more me in terms of where I'm from and what I represent. So as already described, I work at SUNY Cortland, graduated from the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. I did my postdoc training at the University of Florida in Gainesville, and I'm here now in upstate New York. Born in Nigeria, immigrated to Chicago in 1997. I was about 8 years old. And like I mentioned, I do identify as a 1.5 transnational Nigerian American. And I'll get into the details. I know it's not a term that's typically used when we talk about African immigrants, but I'll explain why it's very relevant, and it's an emerging identity. So just real quickly, I do want to give you the inspiration for my research agenda. This is something that I consider and I call it to myself, and when I describe it to other people, I call it me search, right? Because it's research about me, my experiences, my community, and the people that I represent, and those who come after me that I hope represent where I'm from as well. The African diaspora, as we all know, is one of the fastest growing groups, increasing by almost twofold since 2000 to 2010, but even to 2010 to 2018 has increased almost by 52%, right? But a lot of times there hasn't been a lot of understanding that really illuminates, or I should say even illustrates, the dynamic that happens between those who identify as African Americans, or so-called the American descendants of slaves, and those who identify as contemporary African immigrants who have immigrated to the United States since 1965 after the Civil Rights Movement because of the Post-Hart-Celler Act. And, you know, we arrived because of lottery or different types of, you know, academic reasons and professional reasons and the pursuit of affluence, so to speak. But there's a lot of missing, I should say, a dearth of information that exists when it talks about the overall health outcomes of these respective populations. The African immigrant community tends to be overlooked because of this constant homogenous grouping of those who identify as African Americans and those who are African. They assume that there's a one-size-fits-all to take care of our issues, and not taking into consideration our different cultural nuances and where we're from, whether we're from Senegal, whether we're from Nigeria, whether we're from the Bronx, whether we're from Chi-Town, wherever it is. They don't necessarily take into consideration that there is diversity in being Black, right? It's not just one color. It's Black is beautiful, as we know, but there's a lot of diversity that emerges from it. But again, we have to be the ones that take priority over who speaks for us, because like Drake said, no one else likes us except for us. So I will move on with that in terms of transnationalism and health, right? I want to define what transnationalism is for the sake of this conversation. And technically speaking, it's identified by anthropologist Nancy Gillick-Schiller and some other well-known anthropologists, as Stephen Vertovec, as a sustained long-distance border-crossing connection that can be found in several ways, including communication, networks, social movements, or even social groups, right? But these are very reflective in our respective communities through the form of hometown associations. Many of us, if we've grown up in immigrant homes and have some transnational ties, whether it's through our parents, we belong to certain communities, whether it's a church, which is predominantly, in my case, Nigerian, or some of us may belong to a Lagosian, or even an Umo Igbo, which is a national organization for those who identify as Igbo ethnic tribe. So there are all these organizations in which people can relate and use as a way to be able to sustain their identity and cultural practices here in the United States while resisting acculturation and not fully becoming a full-blown American, and still having a lot of involvement with a lot of the affairs that are happening back in their native homeland. So is transnationalism dual citizenship? To some degree, but you don't necessarily need to have two passports. Some countries don't even allow that. Is it biculturalism? Yeah, to a certain degree. There are many people, though, who have multiple cultural identities and practices, but don't necessarily belong to multiple countries, right? So it's a hodgepodge, but transnationalism tends to take into consideration all of the above. But most importantly, just the ties that you establish between the country that you or your parents resettled in and the land that they belong in from. All right, so how can transnational African immigrants be cared for when they're not understood? And I'll explain this because my mother is in Chicago. She lived in Chicago for, Lord knows, probably about 35, 40 years now. My mother's the most Nigerian woman you ever meet, ever. And Dr. Titi can speak to that, right? But she's the most Nigerian woman you'll ever meet, right? Her accent is still there. She has deep freezers for days where she has all the African food, shaki. She makes, she eats African food. She has not, in her 20, 30, 40 years being here, I can count a handful of times in which she's eaten an American food, or what we call soul food. She is 100% thoroughly Nigerian despite how long she's been here, right? So a lot of the research studies will say that the longer you've been here, the more you're forced to acculturate, but she's an example as to one that's truly resisting acculturation in order to sustain the identity that she believes so strongly in and the practices that she values so much. And yet, if my mother's getting older, right? And when she goes to a doctor and she wants to explain what she eats, because we understand when we talk about hypertension, when we talk about diabetes, when we talk about even cardiovascular risk, when my mom says something to the doctor and she said, "What do you eat?" She said, "Amala." And we do. What does the doctor say? The doctor doesn't know what that is, especially if it's in the medical field where we know predominantly it's a lot of people who identify as white, unless they had done some type of, unless they've done some type of Doctors Without Borders or something to that nature where they would visit Africa, no one knows what Amala and Ewedu is. No. So how can my mother be taken care of, and how can she be put in a position to be able to practice healthier habits, and I'll find alternative ways to be able to eat the food that she loves so dearly while still staying very close to identity? Because food is a major way, it's a major indicator of how people sustain their identity, that and their name. And I'll explain about name as well. So now I want to break down the definitions because some people are not privy to how these generational things work. And I explain it in points of the next generation of transnational. So we all know the first generation, that's a term that's used commonly. Those are the individuals that are foreign born that took the trip from their homeland to their new land, and they are resettled or in the process of resettling and acculturating and assimilating, all those A words. But the 1.5 generation, which I identify as, is the children of those immigrants who were born in said country, but traveled at a young age before their late teenage years, but during their formative years. So as I mentioned, my story is that I arrived at the United States at the age of 8 in 1997, still very young, still understanding what home was, but also looking forward to what America was, as far as where I spent most of my adolescence, most of my formative years, learning what life is, learning about identity, learning about all these various practices, while still being at home, being told that I'm very much so Nigerian and I can't lose my Nigerian way, even though I was only 7 years old, still acculturating to a world that was predominantly not Nigerian. So I find myself in between because I'm very familiar with what it was to be back in Nigeria, but I also didn't fully grow up there. So I am a tweener, so to speak. While we have the second generation, who are the ones whose parents already migrated and settled here. However, they were born in the new land. And so some people then also identify them as the first generation of blank Americans. So some people say that if I, for example, I have a son, my son will be considered first generation Nigerian American because he is the American, right? Not fully the of the immigrant background. So I just wanted to use that for the sake of the conversation as I continue to move along. And here's just some examples of some people, if you do not know, or you do know, that you may have seen on TV in different places. Alvin Kamara, for example, is an NFL football player. He's a second generation Liberian. You have Yvonne Ojiri, who you've seen from Insecure, who's also a stand-up comedian. She is first a 1.5 generation Nigerian. Tiwa Savage, Idris Elba, Issa Rae, who is a second generation Senegalese American, a lot of people do not know. And over here is Damson Idris for the popular show Snowfall that just came out, new season. Damson Idris is representing Nigeria, but he's also representing London as a second generation. And then you have Abby Phillip, who's a second generation Trinidadian American. So, I mean, there's so many. And Giannis Adetokounmpo, who has an interesting story because his parents migrated from Nigeria to Greece and then from Greece to America. So you have these multiple transnational connections to two countries, right? But he's very much so Nigerian. If you follow his Instagram or you follow him on social media, he's very big into his culture as a Nigerian. And it's actually, the Greek is Adetokounmpo, and that's what he uses, but it's Adetokounmpo. That's actually the original name. So there's so many of us that are within this next generation that I'm describing that are already here, and their presence is felt very much so in various parts of this country in particular. So now let's talk about the points of connection. This is where I describe what the struggles are for people who are specifically in the 1.5 and second generation, right? A lot of us, and I'm going to say us because I'm part of this, a lot of us tend to deal with issues in regards to not just race, right, and gender, but we also have to deal with the multinationality, right? Many of us may have parents who are from multiple countries in Africa, or even multiple countries when we talk about America and Africa, African countries. So trying to figure out where do you fit in? And that's a struggle that a lot of that we've had throughout a lot of conversations, myself included, growing up. Where do I fit in? Right. And I put the word my name because name plays a major role that a lot of times tends to be overlooked. And I've had a conversation before that talks about the power in the name and how, for me, for example, I've had to change my name as I was growing up. And then I came back to Kaleigh, right? Because I wanted to fit in. So I started off, right, when I was in elementary school, my mom used to call me Kelly, so I started off with Kelly, but then it was like, oh, that's a girl's name. So I changed it to Kenny when I was in elementary school. In middle school, I changed it to Kenny because I was around white people, and that was more familiar because Kelly Kelly still was a girl's name, so I changed it to Kenny. And then when I got to high school, it was still Kenny. I got to college freshman year, then it was Kels, right? And then by the time I got to senior year, grad school, and I really got deep into my African pride. Of course, most of y'all who are listening probably are part of African student organizations. You can relate. When you get into these organizations, you develop and cultivate this massive pride in where you're from. And you're like, yo, I've been missing out on all the good stuff for all these years because I've been trying to be something that I'm not, right? So you then come back to who you are. And I came back to Kaleigh and I realized that Kaleigh is a much better person in all these iterations that I created that I wasted my time. So the power in a name, because you create different performances or different aliases that have different performances and expectations. And that's another struggle that we've had to talk about in this transnational experience. And another one is this idea of reverse acculturation, which I coined in a publication of mine in 2017, which is, some people would say is similar to acculturation, but I explained the difference. And I use the quotes here because a lot of y'all may be able to relate for those who have lived in immigrant households. When you come in this house, you're Nigerian. I put African, but for me, it was you're Nigerian. When you leave this house, you're American, right? That in itself explains the transnational experience and the negotiating of identities that a lot of us have to deal with. But the reverse acculturation is this. A lot of us have been trained, especially those who were born here. You've been brought up and indoctrinated in a culture to a country that some of us may have not been to ever, if not just once or twice. I know people who speak the African language very fluently, have an accent, and they've never been to the country. They have an accent, they eat the food, they are so indoctrinated into a culture. They've acculturated to another land, and they've never been to that land. You're reversing that process. You're engaging in the process of resisting acculturating to American lifestyle, but yet you're indoctrinated into the African world that your parents tell you that you belong to. And that in itself is what I call reverse acculturation. And it creates a disconnect sometimes with the first generation and our parents, because they don't understand fully what second generation or even 1.5 generation have to deal with as far as navigating America as a Black person, right? As a young Black person trying to fit in and trying to make a life for themselves. It's completely different than someone who just immigrated and is trying to make a life for themselves as well. Right. So those are different things. And then we have to also deal with the authentication process. People always got to verify us and try to give us our blue check marks as Africans, which is this: are you real or not? Where your original, your accent, you speaking Yoruba with a little bit of accent, your broken English, be a little shaky. Well, you sabi very well. Like you're speaking, but people are sizing you up to see how authentic you are because you have an American accent. Even when people who travel back to the homeland who have been here all their lives, it's like they always say, it's like, man, they can smell the American in me. Like, I don't even realize, the mosquitoes even know, right? Like it's crazy. So, but this verification process that we go through to authenticate how real we are or how real we're not is also something that we struggle with because we're trying so much to compensate. Who do we want to compensate for? Do we want to compensate for being Black American and live in the Black American lifestyle so we can fit in and have friends in the States? Do we want to be able to fit in back home when we go visit to be able to make sure that, our aunties and uncles approve of us and make sure that we haven't missed out and we're not lost in America? Because that was something that I've been told all my life by family members in America is, don't go and get lost in America. Don't get lost, right? So those are the negotiations and the debates that you have to that I've had to deal with and others can relate to. Now, how do we build these bridges, right? The whole concept of transnational bridges. We have conversations, and a lot of us try to have conversations in different ways. We have conversations among our families, our friends. These are things that a lot of y'all are not unfamiliar with. You all have these conversations personally. You all may be having these conversations right now. We have it on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and definitely Clubhouse. I don't know how many of y'all are familiar with Clubhouse, but Clubhouse is a cesspool for all these really horrible conversations that happen between African immigrants and African Americans. So many things are happening in Clubhouse in particular. And of course, research. I mean, I again use the word research because I use my skills as a researcher, as a scholar, to be able to find ways to bring these issues to the table to make it a conversation worth having. So I also know that having focus groups, one-on-one interviews specifically compared to surveys and other quantitative tools, because our dynamic as transnationals, as Black people, as Africans is very rich and yet to be unpacked. So a lot of times research like this in this field tends to require a lot more of a qualitative approach, because you have to be able to dig in and bring out this rich dynamic that I'm describing. And then we also have talk shows and podcasts, different types of media outlets that we're trying to use now, where people are trying to tell our stories. I have a podcast, My Black is Transnational. I host it. I've had the pleasure of also hosting having Dr. Clark on the show. We had a great conversation. Her podcast is on here as well, the HipHop African podcast. Great content, really interesting conversations about the transnational experience, but with a hip hop flair, and not just new age hip hop. She's a big fan of old school real hip hop, right? So then you have the Pansa Forum, who is actually, which is a great one, and I'm highlighting this particularly because it's one of my aunties, my adopted aunties, Miss Kemi Syracuse, a very a community member in New York City, who is this is the first time I was able to have a conversation with someone that was from my mom's generation, right? And we had this dialogue about the experience of a first generation African and what the challenges are raising children in America. And we collaborated, and I encouraged her to start this podcast where she can be able to bring these things to the forefront. And she's done such an amazing job with it. And of course, there's another one in Chicago, the Jeremy Kofi Convo, which is more of a video conversation that describes the experiences of young African immigrants and Black immigrants in America. So here's some of the things I want to share, some clips and some sound bites from the conversation that I've had from my podcast, because again, I love research, but a lot of times, one of the things I always find very important is that I'm not trying to publish and establish myself as a researcher in spaces where people where I'm from don't see the content and read the content that I'm talking about. I want to make sure that the people who are going to benefit from my work are actually going to see it and feel it. So I created my podcast as a way to translate my scholarly work into the language of the day-to-day, everyday person. I wanted to just have these regular conversations that people can relate to. And then, I can speak the research talk when it's time to do the research thing. So I'll just give you a clip, because this was a very important theme that was very consistent when I, would have these conversations with various people. And it wasn't cool to be African back in the day. Now it is, and I'll explain why, but it wasn't cool growing up as a young African immigrant in Chicago, and a lot of people could relate. Hopefully, oh no, let's go back. Let's play this.
About Black culture. People don't want to admit it now.
What school did you go to?
Marcus Garvey.
Okay, Garvey. Okay.
Marcus Garvey. And so it wasn't cool to be African, and so for those of us, and I know you want to talk about assimilation later, assimilation a little later, but you got to think about when you are in an environment where you are the minority, and I mean that from the perspective of, yes, we were all Black, but being African was not the norm, So you got things like African Beauty Scratcher, which I was glad one of the guests on my show admitted it. When I said, thank you for admitting that, and so there was a point where I couldn't articulate this until recently. I shied away from being African. Like, I tried to convince myself that I was Black. Mm-hmm. And so it didn't even really dawn on me until later in life that, wow, I have a lot of these unique experiences. And even to this day, it's like, how do you identify? Like, when I go to Ghana, I am not considered a a Ghanaian by them. Like, realistically, I wasn't born there. They can tell by the way I walk, the way I talk, the way I dress that like I'm not from here. And when I'm here, a lot of Black Americans don't consider me to be Black. And it wasn't until recently where I can say I can accept both parts of my experience. I don't have to choose or decide, but that took and still takes a little bit of unpacking and self-awareness.
Okay, so I just realized that I was being very loquacious and I talked a little bit past my time. So I apologize for that, Dr. TT. Appreciate you holding me accountable. I will make sure that I share the rest of these sound clips. I have a couple more. I was almost done, but I will make sure that I share the rest of these sound bites when we have our Q&A session, and we can talk a little bit more about that. But I want to
Thank you very much. No, it's exciting to listen to this. Thank you very much. But I wanted us to also get into this conversation, and then we can have that. So I don't know whether somebody had their hand up. Okay, good. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Clark. Dr. Clark, please take it away. Thank
you. So I'm just really going to try to be brief and look at the DC portion of kind of the reason I got into the research. So the Washington DC area. So when I started teaching at Howard University, one of the things I started to notice, specifically in my Intro to Contemporary Africa class, which serves as like a general requirement, so students can take it to meet certain requirements, students who had similar backgrounds as myself, either one or both parents were from Africa, and many of them were trying to connect with that part of their identity, and taking an African studies class for them was often part of that journey. And so for some, I started, talking to some of these students, and they would talk in class and share. And for some, it was a culture clash between them and their parents, and it created a division. In some cases, the parents insisted on raising them exactly the way in which they were raised back home. And that, of course, created a significant clash. In other cases, some parents didn't see the value in teaching the kids the language and the culture, so they would cook, African food for themselves, but then give their kids pizza, and kind of not see the value in feeding their kids the African foods, and really want their kids to speak English while the parents spoke the whatever African language amongst themselves. So then there was that division. In some cases, the mother, and I found this, quite a bit, whenever it was an African American married to an African, it was the vast majority of the time an African American mother married to an African man, or, partnered with. And so if there was a separation and the African American mother was raising the child or children, sometimes she did not know enough about the father's culture to kind of pass that on. And if there was tension between the parents, then, that meant that child was left kind of not knowing. There were a couple cases where the student was queer, and so then that created its own division between that student and the parents. And so there were just increasingly these students who were kind of coming into Howard. And again, my own experience not having that at all, not having that many, because we all know that the 80s is really when you started to see the significant rise in African migration to the US. So you're talking about the children of that 1980s, early 90s kind of influx of African migrants. And so I will actually forgot to start sharing my screen, but I'll do that right now.
We'd love to hear your own experience too, because you were talking about that at the beginning. Yeah, as a Tanzanian child in Cleveland, Ohio. It'll be fascinating to hear.
Well, yeah, being in Cleveland still has a fairly small African immigrant population, but then the Tanzanian population was very much non-existent. I mean, there were small West African populations, but, and so for me, part of my journey was wanting to do a study abroad as an undergrad to Tanzania. So I did a year in Tanzania, and that was to kind of, really get in touch with that part of who I was, because I thought it was really, really important. And then when I came to grad school, unbeknownst to myself, I decided to come to grad school in DC, not knowing that I was coming to DC, Washington, DC, during a time when the area was kind of seeing this significant influx of Africans coming to the area. And I don't, I mean, it was the DC area in the early 2000s when you started really seeing, I mean, summertime, you would have like, Tanzanians playing the Cameroonians in soccer. They had a whole league set up. There'd be a Senegalese DJ, so you would go to a Senegalese spot. There was a Tanzanian spot. There was a Nigerian spot. It was heaven. I mean, for someone like me who did a year in Tanzania, and was now literally amongst a diverse sea of Africans who were, in my age group. And we were all, going to college and working. I worked at Starbucks, and right next door to me was Whole Foods. And if you know anything about Whole Foods, I mean, Africans, I don't know about all the Whole Foods, but the Whole Foods in Washington, D.C., most of them had Senegalese working at Whole Foods. And so it was a really great time to be in D.C., and you learned a lot about different groups of people. So being at Howard, you're seeing people coming in from students coming in from all over the country, from having these various experiences. And so that also, seeing that kind of really made me want to look at this question of identity. And then people kind of questioning me in terms of what am I? And again, that question of not really kind of being able to give an easy answer. And being challenged by my friends who were African American, who had known me again as African American and challenged my identity as Tanzanian. And it was, somewhat upsetting, but, or people who were from the continent who challenged my, identity as well. And so there were all of these interesting things. So I wanted to ask all these questions, well, what are you? What shapes who you are? The factors that influence identity and how we form these identities and how we identify ourselves. So if I see myself as one thing, what about how other people see me? And I think that was one that's been, there is pain attached to that. So for example, when I speak Swahili, I speak it sometimes with an American accent, and I don't speak perfect Swahili. Tanzanians have no problem making fun of my Swahili or my accent. And there's pain there because I'm Tanzanian and there's pain. But there's also recognition that if I were to tease a Tanzanian for their English pronunciation, and that's inappropriate. And I realize that, but there's also kind of this idea that their valuing of English versus Swahili and kind of how they see the language and the power there. And no matter how much I try to explain that it hurts my feelings, Africans, you can't say it hurts your feelings. You're just like, you're being ridiculous. And so it's kind of useless. But then I started kind of looking at the experiences of first and second generation African. And then I started realizing, when I found out Black Lives Matter, one of their founders was a second generation African immigrant. Organizations like Black Alliance for Just Immigration. These organizations that were having significant impacts on conversations around race and immigration, that second generation African immigrants were playing significant roles in these conversations, I thought was really fascinating. And it wasn't just in the US. You have acculturation in France, who was also, instrumental in kind of looking at police brutality, against Blacks in France. So I was wanting to, I wanted to look at, how are what role do first and second generation African immigrants in the diaspora play? And in some cases, looking at how they are able to, in partnership with those at home, speak out in ways that may be at home. So when you had, for example, this flag, and Zimbabwe made it illegal to wear the flag in a certain way, the diaspora was able to then post images of them wearing the flag. So they continued the movement. When Sudan tried to kind of shut down the internet, the Sudanese diaspora kind of picked up the baton, and they really kind of pushed the whole, everybody turn their, profile picture blue for Sudan. In SARS, we know that the diaspora, the Nigerian diaspora and Nigerians in Nigeria were really partners in getting that movement. I mean, a lot of people in the diaspora knew about it because the communities were working in conjunction. And so kind of really looking at that, the activism, but looking at, what does that say in terms of identity and kind of being able to, and it is it's a fine line, because you don't want to say, well, I'm in America and I know better, and I'm going to say, I'm going to dictate. So it's allowing the activists in the community at home to tell you how you can best contribute to the movement. But then seeing again how these individuals are contributing back home. And then looking specifically at England, one of the things that's been fascinating to me, and I kind of really want to spend some time in England lately because of all the amazing kind of things coming out of England, like, just the films and TV shows, and there's a new one, it just came out, I think it's on HBO. These are like young 20-something, and I tried watching it and I could not relate, but it was great because these were Black Brits talking about their lives, and it was amazing because you have some, that are actors that portray African Americans, but some that are kind of showing us what being Black and British is and what it has meant. And so the HipHop Factor kind of came into that. And I have kind of started doing a comparative analysis of hip hop in the US and in the UK, where in the US it's dominated by kind of this multi-generation African diaspora. And there's a smaller first and second generation African diaspora in the US hip hop scene, where the UK is dominated by first and second generation diasporans. And so that experience is more articulated more in the hip hop. I mean, you have the whole grime music scene, which, was a whole kind of creation of this first and second generation African and Caribbean immigrant communities. And so, again, looking at how mainstream hip hop really, their experiences are kind of centered in the UK versus here. And how, just really looking at those two, and then just finding US artists who were, and then finding out, like, look, a lot of these artists who's are second generation or first or 1.5, in many cases, we don't even know that. Like Wale, we know, but it took a while. I didn't really know Nipsey Hussle family was from Eritrea for a while. Then there were some others, Doja Cat, whose father is South African. I mean, who would have known Doja Cat is South African? Like that's, so versus some of these artists who were in the UK, who clearly are representing, even if they were born in the UK, that dual identity. And so kind of wanting to close, when I started hearing these artists kind of articulating my experience, and it was, because, you remember hearing Blitz the Ambassador and some of the Manifest and some of the artists here, but then when I started hearing women artists like Annie and Shabo and Little Sims and Sampa the Great, just talking about being an African woman in the diaspora, having these dual experiences, it was just amazing because you have these women speaking directly to, so when Annie says identity crisis for me and my crew, we're Black and we're British and African too. So I'm just going to play a second of that. I think I have it lined up.
Concept of fixing a brew. Identity crisis for me and my crew. We're black and we're British and African too. What's so far removed? I'd like to go back to my mother's land. I'd like mental peace and 100 grand. And a paying our slaves and we'll do up raves like it's 98. I'm so 94, but I want what I want and I want when I want it.
So sometimes, like, I feel like I was born a generation too early. I love being Generation X, and I will represent Generation X. But the millennials and, you know, kind of now Gen Z are growing up with more resources in terms of kind of in touch with their communities, with African communities that are more established, especially if they're from, you know, in larger cities, and they are able to connect with each other. They have each other. So they're not in these little islands by themselves, and they have kind of this reinforcement, and they're able to exist and find that support and love and expression and all of that stuff. So so I'm enjoying the research. I'm enjoying kind of, you know, hearing these younger artists kind of express these identities and kind of the dualness of it. But yeah, that's all.
Thank you so much. I think that's a very good segue into Dr. Delica's presentation as a second generation West African. So please take it away.
Definitely great segue. 1 second while I share my slides. One second. Of course, it's giving me issues now. Okay, so you all can see that? Great, sorry, I'm floating in front of my slide. That's the best way I know how to share. I'm just gonna set my timer so that I don't go for too long, but okay, so hi everyone. It's such a pleasure to be in community with you all today. Thank you, Dr. Koror and the Africana Studies Department at Binghamton for the invitation. My remarks will be relatively brief, I think. I'm definitely excited to get into the Q&A. Brief overview, I'm just gonna introduce my research briefly, and then I'm gonna discuss how my research sheds light, or I'm actually gonna introduce my research, talk about my personal experiences related to my research, and then go back and talk more in depth about how my research sheds light on negotiations of identity, race, culture, some of which my co-panelists have already highlighted. Yes. Okay, so my sociological research explores identity, race, and culture through the lens of the children of African immigrants in the United States. So between 2015 and 2018, I conducted interviews and ethnographic observations with 71 high school children of West African immigrants. And they lived and went to school in 3 different boroughs in New York City, Brooklyn, Bronx, and Manhattan. I also interviewed almost 50 of their peers and their teachers as well, just to kind of round out my understanding of what was going on. And currently I'm working on developing this research into a book, and also beginning the next phase of this research where I follow up with these youth who are now young adults in their early 20s. So we know that adolescence is a critical moment for cognitive and identity development. And I'm primarily interested in how these young people make sense of their racial and ethnic identities, especially in a society where both Blackness and immigration are criminalized. I'm especially, in addition, I need to be good about switching my slides when I'm talking. In addition, you know, what are the contextual factors that are shaping their identity? And when I say contextual, I'm especially interested in how they're navigating ethnic and racial boundaries within their Black and Latinx communities. So this research is deeply shaped by my personal experiences. I am the daughter of Senegalese immigrants. And as a child growing up in the Bronx, I had a lot of anxiety that has kind of come up in previous presentations. I had a lot of anxiety about being African, right? Because I got these messages at school and in my neighborhood that being African was somehow less than. And then I ended up at a boarding school in New Hampshire randomly for high school. And just like that, I wasn't African anymore. In this overwhelmingly white school, I was ascribed the Black American identity with all the stereotypes that they had about Black Americans from low-income communities. And so this is when I learned that identity is situational depending on context, and that identity is also very much about how others see you, not just how you see yourself, which are themes that come up a lot in my research. So fast forward to college, when I start taking sociology classes, and I'm introduced to language that helps me begin to understand my life experiences up until that point. Yet, the more I learned in those classes, the more frustrated I was by what I perceived as the relative invisibility of African immigrants and their children, at least in the sociological literatures on Blackness and immigration. So it's such an honor to be on the panel with Dr. Clark, because I remember when I first encountered your 2008 piece on first and second generation identities and feeling seen, right? But unfortunately, that happened a little later in my journey. So I was somewhat frustrated that I wasn't seeing the stories of families like mine in the sociology curriculum being taught to me. And so that's why I pursued the PhD in hopes of contributing the stories of African immigrants and their children to sociological understandings of race and immigration. So back to my research, I'm going to share just 3 aspects of my work that sheds light on how identity, race, and culture are negotiated amongst the second generation West African youth. So first, my research highlights that you can't fully understand how youth today are negotiating their identities without paying attention to the unique socio-historical moment or context, right, that they're growing up in. So as members of Generation Z, so youth who were born between 1995 and 2015, they're the smartphone generation. They're the social media generation. They're also coming of age in the era of the movement for Black Lives. And then let's not forget the Obama and the Trump administrations, right? Additionally, which Dr. Clark touched on in her presentation, right? They're coming of age in yet another wave of African influence and celebration of African cultural forms in American popular culture. So we can think about the popularity of Afrobeats music, right? So the Burna Boys, the Whiz Kids. We can think about movies like Black Panther, or literature like Americana or Homegoing. We can even think about cultural icons like Beyonce, who publicly wear Ankara print patterns and prints and other African styles, right? You know, keep in mind that African influences in American culture are not new. For example, the Black Power movement of the 60s and the 70s also saw kind of large scale adoption of African cultural forms, like names and like clothing as part of like self-determination projects. And so we're seeing, I say today, we're seeing yet another kind of cultural wave of African influence in American society. And this is helping to change mainstream perceptions of Africans and has a direct impact on how adolescent children of African immigrants navigate their identities. So many of my respondents who had been ashamed, which we talked about this, the shame piece, right, growing up, who had been ashamed of their African identities in childhood, share that they only recently began to more proudly claim it. You know, one respondent even told me that they were, you know, they used to be ashamed of like listening to African music too loudly on the subway, right? But now they blast it and they don't care, right? So these youth kind of attribute their growing pride in their ethnic identities to Africans becoming cooler, which Dr. Lambert spoke about as well, right? And you know, in my observations in the schools, I saw youth across racial and ethnic groups adopting African cultural forms. Like walking through the schools, you know, I'd see Puerto Rican youth, you know, wearing Ankara print in their accessories, or I'd see like Black American girls kind of rocking newly popular Fulani braids in their hairs, right? These are examples. So these examples also importantly highlight how African immigrants and their children are actively contributing to American culture and are not just merely passive actors. More broadly, I think that this moment has the capacity to build cross-cultural bridges and strengthen kind of cultural exchange and solidarity between Black ethnic groups, especially various young Black ethnic youth. So second thing I wanted to highlight is that I don't think you can fully understand second generation African identities without appreciating children's agency. Children are, a vulnerable group, but at the same time, they also have agency in constructing their own lives. And as I'm finding, they have agency around their racial and ethnic identity negotiations and boundary work. So for example, I find that some of my second gen respondents, especially those who identify as Muslim, are explicitly drawing on religion as a tool to kind of maintain boundaries between themselves and other groups, especially Black American groups, right? So this kind of suggests that we need to be paying attention to children's agency and also religion if we want to better understand identity development and boundary construction among second generation Africans. And then lastly, my work also explores the situationality of identities, which has also come up, right? So I saw trends in identity. There were some things that in my research I saw happen across neighborhoods, but then there were also some specific neighborhood demographics, like contextual features that also mattered. So for example, in Brooklyn, where the Afro-Caribbean / West Indian community is especially large, second gen African youth, there's more like of a blurry boundary between them and other Black ethnic groups. But for the youth that I talked to in the Bronx and in Harlem, where there's a larger African immigrant population and also a large Latinx immigrant population, I found slightly brighter kind of racial and ethnic boundaries between these groups. So you can think about it on the neighborhood level, but you can also think about it, how an identity is situational in the transnational context, which has also been brought up, right? So for example, youth who generally were not identifying as American in the US context, because they kind of believe an American identity to be white and to be wealthy, and they don't identify with that in the US context, but then they travel. For those who travel and visit their African home countries, they are ascribed an American identity that in that context becomes deracialized, and instead it centers around socioeconomic status and does so in ways that actually benefit these youth when they're there. So thinking about how they identify as American or don't, depending on the transnational context. And it's not just national identity, but also what happens to their African ethnic identities and their racial identities when they travel. Something I'm interested in. So overall, my research on these youth kind of highlights, for me, the fact that, understanding the stories of African immigrants and their children is essential to making sense of Blackness, race, and immigration in this country. I'm looking at low-income African youth, and many of them, given the fact of racial segregation and housing and schools, like a lot of these children of lower income African immigrants are highly likely to live and attend schools in majority minority communities absent of whites. So it's their interactions specifically with other Black and Latinx groups that shape how they think about their racial and ethnic identities. And in this way, you see that Blackness is kind of being constructed, at least amongst these youth, independent of whiteness, and that these youth are helping to expand our understandings of Blackness outside of a narrow Black-white paradigm. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so very much. Really appreciated it. Thank you very much. We're going to come back to question. And so we're going to have Dr. Funmilayo Showers give a presentation, which is also a good segue, because now we're talking of these older generations that are now working in this contest. So Dr. Funmilayo, please take it away.
All right, thank you, Dr. Okoro, for this invitation, and it is a great honor to be part of this panel. I know with colleagues whose work I know, so this is really exciting. And so I've written this whole thing. I was going to give this whole speech, but I know we're running out of time, so I'm just going to try to talk my presentation really quickly and hopefully get us into the Q&A. So I also want to enter this conversation as a sociologist who's done ethnographic and interview-based work, but I focus on first-generation immigrants from West Africa who came to the US mostly after 1980. So the parents of the people that you all, that Delica has talked about. So I studied really mostly people from Nigeria, Ghana, Sierra Leone, and Liberia who work in the DC area, and they work in healthcare as nurses and as paraprofessional nursing aides, home health aides, etc. So like everybody else, for me, this research is both intellectual and deeply personal. I remember when I came to the US at the age of 18. So I'm sort of somewhere in the middle. I'm not 1.5, but I'm not really first generation either. So I'm sort of in there. I came to the US to live with my aunt who had helped me come to America. She was working as a university professor in a small liberal arts college. And I lived with her during the 4 years I was in college, right? But she will talk about the work experiences that had shaped her as an immigrant, as an African immigrant. You see, while she was working as a university professor at the time, when she just came to America, she had worked as a nursing assistant, a CNA, right? And if you don't know anything about these jobs, these are the sort of paraprofessional individuals who work in nursing homes mostly. They take care of older adults. They do the sort of dirty work, quote unquote, bathing, lifting, so it's very difficult work. And so my aunt's journey was what really made me become interested in work and labor force participation, especially also because I started seeing that my friends and people who I knew, other people in my family, cousins, who also moved to the US were going into healthcare, right? People who wanted to be lawyers, engineers, etc. They were becoming nurses. And so my personal observations are also corroborated by the data that we have on immigrants in the healthcare labor force. So for example, first generation African immigrants make up just like 4.5 to 5% of the total immigrant share of the population, very small but fast growing. But in healthcare occupations, they make up 12% of the foreign born. So this sort of over concentration. And within healthcare occupations, the data also shows that Africans are likely to work as RNs, but also as CNAs, home health aides, etc. So this sort of bifurcation of the labor market. So now back to my aunt's story. So her experience was very similar to other West African immigrants I started interviewing. So people who had worked as working age adults, who had come to the US as working age adults. Oftentimes they came from middle-class backgrounds, they had professional occupations. Most of them had no idea about like nursing homes, what even nursing homes was. So they became, they had no idea of paid, what is called care work as employment. So they found themselves in these occupations after migration. And I'm happy to talk to you about why, if we have time. But then how did they fare in these occupations now that, since they were not care workers before? And how do their experiences, especially their experiences with race and racialization, shape the identities that they develop? So those are the questions that I sort of asked in my research. Now, I found that their experiences and the identities they developed were shaped by the context in which they work, just like others have argued, situational context, but in my case, sort of professional context. So for example, the ones who worked as home health aides, they usually almost always cared for older adults, mostly white people, elderly people in their homes. And they would talk about racism in very sort of interactional, personal ways, right? They experience feeling exploitation, degradation, humiliation, go by one-on-one by going into the house, right, of people. Like people told me things like they call me monkey, that kind of stuff. Don't share the food that's in the fridge, etc. Now, so some who worked in the homes of African Americans also talked about feeling degradation, but there are these sort of intra-ethnic, intra-racial divides were more shaped by their class status, right? So these middle-class African immigrants were felt very diminished by doing what they thought was menial, dirty work. And they felt that the people they cared for, they often tended to be more educated than they were. So there were a lot of conflicts around that. The men, so I interviewed a few men, obviously gender was very salient also for the men, because they felt that they had lost some of their male privilege and they were doing work as, women's work, quote unquote, women's work. Now, those who worked in businesses owned by other West Africans, and that's what I found in the DC area where I studied, that Africans had made their way into the sort of entrepreneurial aspects of healthcare. They owned businesses, recruitment agencies, etc. I'm sorry, I'm just seeing your comments in the chat, 1.75, Kaleigh, but so the ones who worked in these businesses, they had very positive experiences. They were working in settings dominated by other West Africans. And in particular, the ones who worked with people with intellectual disabilities felt they had very positive emotions, satisfaction, intrinsic rewards, just the satisfaction of doing the kind of work that they do. In fact, so a lot of them said that they had seen these jobs, the people who worked at disability support professionals, they had entered these jobs like they thought it was like a temporary thing. But especially the disability support folks, they thought they were changed so fundamentally by working with that population and working usually in settings with other Africans that they thought they remained in these jobs. Now, those who had made their way into skilled nursing professions, they worked in nursing homes and hospitals with usually white patients, white co-workers, or places with more ethnic and racial diversity. They talked a lot about experiencing racism, right? So a common story that people told me was that they'll walk into a patient's room and the patient would assume that they were the nursing aide, and a white nursing aide will be assumed automatically to be the nurse. And other scholarship on African-American nurses have found that. Now, they also talked about a specific form of discrimination that I am calling African origin discrimination, which is that they felt that because they were African, people perceived them more negatively. And I find that very interesting in comparison to the second generation, who are seen, in some ways, cool, their identity as African is cool and transnational. The first generation thought being African was particularly bad, especially in mainstream settings. They thought people all associated Africa with, all this, think about all the stereotypes, Ebola, wars, and all that kind of stuff. So they felt, in addition to being Black, that being African, a lot of them said being foreigner, was a difficult thing. So then they also try to enact a lot of different strategies to combat that. For the nurses, a lot of them talked about the working harder, working twice as hard. A lot of them said working extra to sort of prove themselves. But you can think about the emotional toll of those kinds of strategies. Others talked about getting more credentials in nursing as a way to sort of be upwardly mobile, but also to gain respect. So, nursing in the profession, people work to get more credentials all the time. But these African immigrants saw getting credentials as a further way to sort of combat or mitigate the effects of racism. As one woman told me, quote, "If you don't respect me for who I am, you respect my certificate," unquote. So what do my findings among first-generation African immigrant healthcare workers mean for our general understanding of race, identity, and the new African diaspora? So I will briefly just say a few things, and then I could sort of expand in the Q&A if we have time. Now, I speak a lot to the scholarship in sociology and probably in the social sciences, which I think are drawn in immigration. I think it had drawn its insights from English-speaking Caribbean immigrants, really Caribbean immigrants in New York City. And they had extrapolated from these findings to make these claims about Black immigrants. One of these claims, which is debated, right, is that Black immigrants actually experience their identity, their ethnic identity, as a positive. So for example, being Jamaican, it was argued, right, might be perceived very differently than being African American. And some of those scholars, at least in the sort of early iterations, talked about the fact that employers, for instance, preferred foreign-born Blacks compared to African Americans. This is sort of old school scholarship. But I think, as my research shows, right, there's a heterogeneity of experience among Black immigrants, obviously by generation, but even among the first generation, ethnicity matters. The regional origin matters. The stereotypes and meanings associated with regions and specific countries of origin shape how Black immigrants are received, and by extension, the racial identities they develop and the survival strategies they enact. I also contend that the context of professions, including the ethnic and racial composition of the workforce, the work relations within specific industries and settings, shape these identities. I looked at nursing, where there's been a long documented history of racism. Again, in nursing, you're talking about what I think of as tactile proximity, right? Close, interpersonal, physical touching. A lot of people said the people they cared for will say, don't touch me, I don't want you to touch me, right? So I think that context, right? And you're talking also about maybe older adults who may not have kind of the filters on race and the language of race and other places. So I do think that matters for understanding what I found. But I will stop here for now. And I'm happy to develop these ideas further. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We know this is a very interesting conversation that, there's a lot to unpack here. So I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Ritchie to take it away with the Q&A, and I'll be watching. So I'm going to encourage our participants, please type in your questions. I'll be reading out the questions from participants in the webinar. But in the meantime, Mr. Ritchie, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Dr. Okora. First and foremost, I just want to say thank you to everybody for participating in the panelists. That was really important and salient information. I'm coming from a Congolese background, so listening to some of the stories and whether it's the name or whether it's, the school that I went to, I really appreciate your insights and the research that you've done. So in starting that, I want to start the first question with Dr. Clark here. So you talked a lot about, where we're seeing differences in Europe versus America and this different type of Pan-Africanism that we're seeing. So kind of with the research that you've done, what are some of the representations of Pan-Africanism that you've seen on college campuses and in your work?
Oh, wow. Thanks for the question. Well, yeah, I definitely see these representations playing out differently depending on which part of the diaspora, but even in the United States, places like Washington, D.C., New York, where you have kind of bigger concentrations of kind of African migrant communities, you have kind of more diverse representations, and it's, you have, even more kind of very specific. So you'll have groups, where you'll, Ghanaian restaurants and Kenyan restaurants and, very like nation specific or ethnic group specific. You have like, Ewe associations or Yoruba associations, versus in, a place like Cleveland where, you have associations that kind of include more migrants because there aren't enough to kind of break down. So, it's definitely, I think, interesting in that sense, depending on where you are and the size. And I think, it's interesting, all of us kind of representing kind of the New York, Connecticut kind of grouping, and then Washington, D.C., where we see kind of these large migrant populations versus, areas where, the population is much more sparse. I think is definitely an interesting dynamic when you look at the contrast. But then, of course, overseas, which is one of the things I'm really interested in. I mean, I think with artists like Sampa the Great, who, lived in Australia for a while, where the migration to Australia is fairly recent compared to the US and definitely to the UK, where African migrants are, I don't know, maybe the last couple of decades really started migrating to Australia. So their experiences are fresh and are, they're really kind of going through quite a bit there. And so it's been interesting kind of seeing that experience from afar. But yeah.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Clark. I'm gonna switch it over to Dr. Evie Lambert. So we have to go back to the 1.5 transnational generation. We have to kind of unpack that a little bit. So this question is, in being 1.5 generation influence, how is that intersection of your identity and responding to racial discrimination? Like, how has that impacted your experience around that?
So that's a great question, because that was something that I was going to speak towards. So I mean, I think, speaking personally from my experience, I grew up in a space where I didn't have to care about it. It was out of my own volition that I had to go out of my way to be able to understand the African American experience, right, and why it mattered to me, right, and I think someone mentioned the idea of the North African. We'll talk about that too. But for me, growing up, what was, like, from my mother and my parents and my community growing up, it was like, whatever they say to you as far as insults and racism, that's not your problem. Put your head down, read your book, be successful, and live your life, right? We were told to be able to brush that off, because it was said, that's not our own story, that's their own story, right? So that's not us. We came here for a different reason. That whole issue that they deal with racism, that's them. They got to deal with that, right? But when I was in 8th grade, I did a history project similar to what Delica, Dr. Delica said, of being in a space where you're the only Black person, and now you become this compilation of what it is to be Black, even though you have your own struggle, you got your own book, your chapter, but now you got to be the whole book of Black, right? So now, for me, when I was in 8th grade, I had to do a history project, and I did a history project on Brown versus Board of Education, right? And that whole thing kind of unraveled, and it exposed me to just the actual plight of the African American, because, as most of us know, the African American story is not necessarily fully illustrated in a lot of our history classes, especially if you go to like rich white Catholic schools. It's not. So for me, I had to go out of my way to really dig deep and learn the history. But there are so many of us from my parents' generation specifically who do not know and did not have to truly care about it. It's similar to what was mentioned. It's the younger generation, those who are now pushing the Black Lives Matter movement. They're the ones that are now re-educating some, not all, from that first generation. They're re-educating them about why it's important for you to bridge these gaps, because don't think that just because your name is, your name is Ronke or your name is Kaleigh, that you're going to be the good Black person. It's no longer. You can get shot too. It does so, and that's what's happening now, because you have members from my 1.5 and second generation who have these names, but it doesn't matter. They're still suffering from the same levels of brutality now, because our accents aren't as understandable. They don't care about that. We are blending into the fabric just like anyone else. So we can get it too, just like anyone who's been suffering, from our brothers and sisters who are not necessarily from the continent. So to make a long story short, I had to go out of my way to learn and really empathize with the stories of my brothers and sisters whose ancestors went through that struggle.
I have a quick question. Thank you so much, Dr. Kaleigh, for your response. I have a quick question from the the people in the participants. Somebody asked, are people from North Africa considered African? I think we have a representation of people mostly from East and Western here. I wonder, are people from North Africa considered African? Dr. K?
So it was very interesting. And I know that I didn't get to really finish my whole my slides, but that was that was an important part that I wanted to bring up, which was that idea of bridging that gap, right? Because we do have that intra-continental disconnect that exists. The people from what they call the Middle Eastern, North African, the MENA community tend to not feel like they identify. And I'll just speak specifically to my own experiences interacting with people from, from Egypt. Like I had a student who I had interacted with a couple years ago, and in her and talking about her identity and what her struggles were. And she, mentioned that anytime she goes into these specific, particular spaces like African student organizations or different associations, she feels like the minority, right? It's always the Nigerians and the Ghanaians that are always, and even people from Sierra Leone, they understand it's always the West Africans that are always taken over, and they become the monolith, right? And so for her experiences, she felt like she didn't belong in that space. She didn't belong in the Black American space, and she didn't belong in the authentic Egyptian space. So she found herself struggling with how she wanted to identify, similar to what's already been mentioned ad nauseum here. But it was a little bit more to the next degree, because even within that African space, where most of us who are from West Africa or close to, we were able to find a little bit of a home away from home in college in these African student associations or something of that nature. But when you're now that person from North Africa, you felt singled out and didn't feel like you fit. So it created a little bit more of a disconnect that a lot of my brothers and sisters from North Africa are dealing with, that we need to bring back in and bridge that gap so that we can create a little bit more of that unity.
I think I'm getting questions. Sorry, I'm getting questions from the participants. So I think this question goes to Dr. Delica. Want to get your opinion on this. And the question is, and all of you can contribute to this, but I'm sending it to you because of your focus on second generation. And the question is this: does the process of assimilation include contributing our own culture? This is from one of the second generation to the American culture, or is it that something that happens after assimilation?
Thank you for that question. So the short answer is absolutely yes. I understand assimilation. Assimilation has become kind of a controversial term, at least within sociology. Integration, whatever you want to call it, I understand it as closing the gap between the host society and the immigrant society. So it's not about, the immigrants taking on all the aspects of the host society. It's about bridging the gap, and that looks like movement on both sides, right? And so when you understand it like that, for me, the fact that African immigrants and their children, like I talked about with the socio-historical context, are absolutely contributing to American culture, absolutely kind of redefining what the American cultural pool looks like, right? In ways that all Americans get to draw from, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not about if it happens, you don't assimilate. It's not like you reach a endpoint in assimilation and then you have the freedom. It's like part of what your integration looks like is how you take on aspects of your host society, but also what you give back to it.
Okay. That brings me to another question. Somebody actually asked that what's the most important thing that someone listening to this webinar can do? I'm quoting this directly, so bear with me. What is the most important thing that someone listening to this webinar can do to help with the African identity issue? I don't know whether it's necessarily an issue. So, and that's why I said I'm quoting directly from what the person said. So I'm leaving it open to, you all.
Yeah, I could jump in. I think that, so it's the identity issue. I think maybe understanding a little bit that the US society is changing. And I think I'm gonna like add on a little bit to that assimilation point, which is that, yes, you said earlier, it's that immigrants contribute, right, to the US and contribute to their culture, to US culture. And if we take a broad-based picture, actually, to look at the ways in which US society has just been fundamentally changed by immigration in general, right? Think about your nail salons, you know, like your food, the music, the cuisine, right? So when we think about it in that way, right, we can begin to see that it's, you know, maybe we should shift a little bit from the idea that, like this sort of understanding that, the immigrant identity is one where you lose yourself and become, exclusively just American, whatever that is. Now we know that immigrants maintain aspects of their own culture. They also, in the same way, and I sort of like the way you talked about it, Dr. Sal, this sort of back and forth, bridging the gap. So in terms of the African identity issue, in terms of even thinking about Black identity, I mean, I think we need to also begin to think about that shift in what it means to be Black, right? Yeah. I mean, historically, right, we pay a lot of debt and homage to the African American experience, right? The activism, right, that's paved the way for later generations of Africans to come. But we also have to sort of think about the ways in which the Black identity itself is changing, right? So there's the sort of African American original diasporic identity, but then there are the ways in which subsequent waves of immigration has changed what it means to be Black. And then when we add the transnational identities that you talked so, you guys just sort of really illuminated, right? It is much more complex. So Black identity, its diversity, its complexity, right? And African identity is one piece of that.
I also want to just add to that what was said by Dr. Showers. By also just mentioning that exposure in terms of exposing yourself to different types of resources and information. There's so many of us out there who are telling these stories and trying to bring these things. So as mentioned, it's not necessarily an issue, right? But it's something that is a little bit deeper than that we're trying to unpack. And again, I know that, I want to share this too, because I think this is important. And I'll just briefly share, like there are, documentaries and different types of works out there. You see, there's one documentary recently created by Dr. Nadia Sasso, Am I Too African to Be American, Too American to Be African? Just watched this other one called Bound by Perez Owino, which talks about the dynamic between African Americans and African immigrants. And they have so many people who are out there, whether they're creators, whether they're scholars. You have books by Dr. Beverly Tatum, who talks about why are all the Black kids sitting in the cafeteria table. The disintegration of Black America by Eugene Washington. There are different resources, so many people out there that are trying to tell these stories and trying to create, as Dr. Showers mentioned, who are trying to explain as eloquently and in an articulate manner what the dynamic is and the nuances and the diversity in being Black, not just in America, but all across the world, right? So, I think that's another way that you can be able to continue to just expose yourself to all these informations and listen to so many people's stories, because the truth is we're all kind of saying the same thing, just in different languages and different ways. We really are, and I think all the voices matter, right? Because we have to be able to share, because there is not just one voice for us, but we are all essentially speaking from different perspectives, but all headed towards the same path.
Yeah. And that brings me to the question somebody asked. I love the fact that you talked about the resources that are available. So this person said, what would you recommend to be the first step for some who has an identity issue for them to do and reclaim their own culture? Dr. Delica, you want to take that?
I mean, Delica. Yes. I think my mind goes to how central a role media has played in creating so many tensions. And so I think, Dr. Bay Lambers just mentioned 2 films, or I think documentaries, But I think maybe one place beyond going, right, visiting and, you know, immersing yourself that way. Maybe the funds ain't there right now. You know, COVID is still very real. So like, I think entering through media. So finding shows, documentaries, movies, some that are serious, but some that are, you know, comedy, dramedies, etc., that Netflix has a bunch, like that are highlighting like African, second generation Africans, African cultural forms, etc., in new, exciting ways. Like I think about, you know, for a light show, How to Ruin Christmas. Is like a short, okay, I see some head nods. It's like a 3 episode, and then the new season came out recently, and it's based in South Africa, and it's hilarious. And it's just, I left it feeling so much love and appreciation for South Africans, and like, you know, feeling like in community with them, right? And I'm not being as clear right now, but yeah, that's like, I just say media is one way to maybe start to chip away at that.
Dr. Clark?
I would even say reaching out to kind of community groups in your area. You know, Africans are very family oriented. And so when they find out, you know, who your people are very much, you know, welcoming. So even if you were born and raised here, once they find out, you know, your people are from the same place, people tend to be welcoming, and, you know, you'll be invited to cookouts and different events and things like that. You know, things will start to be expected of you as well, contributions to funerals and other things, but the community will embrace you. So I think that's, you know, one thing, getting in touch with the community. You know, hopefully it's a community where they're large. You know, in my case being Tanzanian, it's a fairly small community. If you're Nigerian, Senegalese, Ghanaian, you know, there are more people. So if it's a smaller community, it may be a little bit more difficult depending on where you are. But you know, you should still be, and if you can't find them physically, you can find them online. So that's the other thing. Finding people online is also a possibility.
Yes, Dr. Kaleigh.
I will just add, in addition to what was said, we've talked about using media, we talked about social media, and I tend to be the proponent, of course, with my Black is Trans Now. I'm all about actually trying to create exposure and going back home. And I know, yes, funds is low and things like that, and I think there are opportunities in which we can be able to get connected. Dr. Clark just mentioned, you know, organizations, and of course, I'm going to use this opportunity as a way to slickly go back to my slides. So, but I want to mention again, right, there are different organizations that are out there that are trying to connect people back to their homeland, right? There's Promitra, which is an organization based in Senegal. They actually do a program called Doorway of Return, where every 2-3 years, they take a group of people back to Senegal and they walk them through, you know, they do a ceremony and they walk them through the Doorway of Return. There's another group in Nigeria called Discover Giddy, which is more of a fun-loving, touristic way of being able to enjoy what Nigerians call Deti December, or most West Africans say Deti December, which is where you go home in December and you have a good time. You get to see the finer things in Africa that's contrary to what media portrays us as, which is this jungle, right? But you get to really see the finer things in Africa. Akwaba experiences in Ghana, based by the same person, Mr. Osagifo Esoan, who created this whole motion of Make Africa Home Again, which, you know, I tend to represent as well. But it's one of those things where I think another way, in addition to all the other things that were mentioned, you know, there's so many different ways in which you can be able to try and reconcile these, you know, whatever you're trying to find. And I think one important thing, again, going back to social media, is Clubhouse. I can't stress that enough. I've talked to several people who are part of major African, whatever country you're from, they have different communities and forums where people are just talking constantly. And I've had many second generation, 1.5, and even first generations who go on Clubhouse and they're just home away from home. It's like a more advanced version of WhatsApp. Let's just put it like that for our younger generation, where we're not just typing, but we're talking and actually talking to one another. And a lot of people use that as a way to be able to learn the language, learn some jargon and slangs and things like that. And they find themselves connected to their people in that manner as well. So I'll stop there.
So, Dr. Thank you very much, Dr. Kaleigh. See, I need to, please, I'm trying to run on time. Dr. Clark, somebody actually had a question for you. And the question is this, is one of the questions I was going to bring up. So I'm happy somebody is bringing this up. Said, you mentioned that some of your queer students, that aspect of their identity furthered a generational divide with their parents. So how does that intersectionality affect the African transnational communities? It's funny enough, one of the things I had was along that line. So she wanted you to ask you that question.
Well, many Africans who identify as queer do find community outside of Africa. You do have organizations in Ghana like Silent Majority that are in Ghana, but also outside of Ghana. Because it is, homosexuality is still illegal in most African countries, it's the safety issue is still there. So you have that, but you do have communities within the continent. It's just not as easy to find. But I would say outside in the diaspora, you definitely have a lot. And you also have a lot of scholars and activists. We had an event last semester with a bunch of activists from Ghana dealing with the Ghana LGBTQ movement. There were a whole bunch of things that happened. The Ghanaian government shutting down a community center, and so we had activists that were mostly based in Ghana. I think a couple were based in the diaspora, mostly based in Ghana. And so they're on social media. So if you plug into a couple people on social media, it's then the gateway to others on social media. So you follow a few people and they will lead you to more, and then you'll kind of get clued into when there's a discussion, when there's an event, when there's a Zoom meeting or a webinar. And then there's a book that just recently came out by Nana Darko, I can't pronounce her last name, The Sex Lives of African Women, which is a great book. It's not just queer women, it's, all kinds of African women. So there's the communities are out there.
Thank you very much. And I know and I know we're running low on time. This makes for a very interesting discussion. Some of the questions I had has kind of been answered. But I want to leave our panelists with these questions. And I know you may not have the answer right now. I see myself as I guess I'm a first generation because I moved here and whatnot. And I help raise my nieces and nephew. And I do what Kaleigh was mentioning, which is when you're in this flat, you are in Nigeria. When you're out there, you're in America. I'm one of those big auntie. And I see how they navigate and how they deal with the issue of who they are, how they even respond to the issue of racism and discrimination. And they come home and they talk to me. They talk to me about what their friends say in school and how they react, and that the African-American friends are surprised that they are not pulling off their, dresses and fighting over these issues. And they're like, I don't have to react that way. But it creates this tension. In essence, even how we respond to the issue of discrimination and racism, the tension between what it means to be an African-American, or what it means to be an African immigrant, or what it means to be an African immigrant descendant child. I think myself and Richie have talked about this, means different things to different people. And somehow these differences seems to inform how folks react and or respond to racial discrimination in America. I wonder whether some of this has been borne out in some of your work, and if you all can just talk a few minutes about this so we can wrap this up, because we have about 5 minutes left.
Could you clarify the exact question?
So the exact question is, has this been borne out in your own work, looking at second generation immigrants, for example? Because you've talked about the fact that these are kids growing up in the boundaries of Black and Latinx. So what does it become for them when it's Black and white, these boundaries of Black and white? And how does that impact how they even react to their experiences of discrimination, if there's any at all? So for some first generation, very few people experience discrimination and know they're experiencing discrimination. I've had friends that I've had to tell, that's a discriminatory attitude. They're like, really? Oh, I didn't know that, because they didn't know. So I just wanted to get, yes.
Yeah. May I jump in a little bit as sort of a first generation, almost get into the African auntie kind of situation? So yeah, I think it's becoming a bit more complicated in this moment. Like, I think George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter movement, I think there's a consciousness that's beginning to be, there's a consciousness even among the first generation, because I think that the killing of George Floyd and all the, think about the moments in which we are, I think that has sort of brought this racism, right, in terms of like, it's in your face, right? I think so. And then people who can sort of see their own child, right, and sort of make the connection that way. For the second generation, so I'm sort of in between, because I came to the US, but I also have cousins who are second generation. And I remember being the bridge between their parents and my cousin. Like, their parents would tell them all the story about Sierra Leone, like old time. I'm like, no, nobody does that But I also think, just looking at my cousins, that the ways in which their parents instilled in them the traditions and the love of the homeland, they grew up fully American, right? They grew up fully like Black and having a Black identity in America, but also just being aware of that other part. I had a cousin, for example, who went to Harvard and had them teach her Creole, the Sierra Leonean language, at Harvard. She's like, for my foreign language, this is what I want to learn. So I think that just sort of speaks to the ways in which aspects of our culture can be a positive force for the second generation, but at the same time, keeping in mind that, and there are other ways in which their socialization in school, a lot of college organizations, all of that stuff helps solidify their identity as Black American as well. So I guess the moment is changing. I think it's complicated a lot by the ways in which the discussions we're having about racism, Blackness, right, which is almost also transnational. People in England, we're talking, and in solidarity, right, with the protests in the US. People on the continent, in Ghana, were in solidarity. I think so. There's a sort of global Blackness and Black identity that connects across generations.
Thank you. 1 minute so that we can wrap it up. Dr. Kaleigh, you had your hand up.
The only thing I was going to add to that is that in the same breath, there are, and I won't go into my slides this time, but there are some people who still, from that future generation, who can truly, and because of that reverse acculturation notion that I brought up, who say, I can't relate. Like, I don't, I had a clip where a young woman basically said, I understand that, the Black American experience, but I don't relate to it. That's not my experience, right? I have cousins and siblings who are, Nigerian American because they're half siblings and their parents are African Americans, and, but they're the ones that are the descendants of slaves. I'm not. So Juneteenth, I can't relate to that. I can relate and understand the racism, but anything that comes after that is not necessarily something that I can relate to, despite growing up here in the United States. So the racism aspect is more of a global, universal, conceptualization, understanding that systemic racism is worldwide, right? It's not necessarily, especially for Black people worldwide. It's not the Black American experience solely that creates this feeling of connection to the racialized experience. It's more so, I know this is something that we all deal with across the board, but your Black experience, your African American experience is not necessarily my experience. So it's completely different. I still am Nigerian, even though I've never been to the country. I still am Nigerian, and everything about how I see life is Nigerian. So
that's interesting.
I just want to say quickly that you also have the fact that the first generation is also dealing with the whole immigration issue in terms of them being immigrants. And so to kind of like stand up and kind of protest is not, but then you also have the fact that were they likely to protest back home? So within SARS, a lot of people were frustrated with first generation Nigerians here who weren't willing to stand up about that back home. But I do see that when it hits home, Africans are more likely. So when Amadou Diallo got killed a long time ago, you did see Africans on the streets. And so when it does hit home like that, you do see Africans coming out, but it takes someone getting killed in that community for that first generation, I think, to actually stand up.
Wow. You know what? This, in fact, because this is a whole pack of story, that we have to unpack, but we don't have time. But I want to say thank you so much to you all. This is an amazing conversation. I mean, I think, Richie, when we're talking about this, we didn't even know it was going to be this way. So we want to say thank you on behalf of the African Studies Department, on behalf of the Multicultural Research Center at BMT University. I want to say thank you to each of our panelists for an amazing job, for the kind of work you do, the stories and the voices you make sure are being heard. I intend for us to have this conversation again, so I'm going to be reaching to each of you for us to organize a one-day in-person conference so we can talk about this issue more, so we can do more with this. I think this is really good. So thank you to each and every one of you for making your time to be here and for discussing your work with us, for sharing your own experience, because I think it matters. I'm going to, Richie, any words?
Just want to say thank you again. This has been very insightful, and we really appreciate the partnership, but also the conversation. So looking forward to continued conversation around this, and we look forward to staying connected.
Definitely. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having us.
No, this is beautiful. I got to pronounce your name correctly. At least out of 4 times, I said it 3 times good. So I'm passing myself on your course.
Have a good day, everyone.
You too. Thank you so much.
Good seeing everybody. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you.